The Prime Minister told us on the record, and I quote, "I believed the lies he told me." If the Prime Minister didn't speak to him, how can he say he lied to him?
He said last night that Muslims praying in public, including the Mayor of London, practising his faith, are not welcome. He described it as an act of domination, straight from the Islamist playbook.
Hi everyone, Oliver here. This is one of those moments where a simple question should have a simple answer, and instead everything spirals. You are about to watch a heated exchange in Parliament where Keir Starmer is asked a direct yes or no question about Peter Mandelson, and instead of answering it, the conversation starts moving in every direction except the one that matters. And that is where this gets interesting. Because once a leader avoids a straight answer, the focus shifts from the issue itself to something bigger: judgment, accountability, and whether the public is actually getting the full picture. If you want more breakdowns that focus on what is really happening in moments like this, make sure you like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you think. Now let's get into it.
So let me ask him now. Did the Prime Minister personally speak to Peter Mandelson about his relationship with the convicted Jeffrey Epstein before appointing him as our ambassador to Washington?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me start where I must. This was my mistake in making the appointment, and I've apologised to the victims of Epstein. I do so again. The government is complying with the humble address in full, but we are also continuing to support the police in their investigation. The matter of process was looked at by the independent adviser on ministerial standards. It's clear the appointment process wasn't strong enough, and that's why I've already strengthened it. But it was my mistake, Mr. Speaker, and I've apologised for it. She should follow suit and apologise for a gross error of judgment in calling for the UK to join the war in Iran without thinking through the consequences.
Mr. Speaker, I know he doesn't want to talk about the documents he tried to bury last week. He's going to try and talk about anything else, but he's not going to get away with it. I asked him a question he did not answer. We know the Prime Minister was warned about the risk of appointing Peter Mandelson. This is not about the process. He knew that Mandelson stayed in Epstein's house after Epstein had been convicted for child prostitution. He knew that, so I will ask him again. Did he speak to Peter Mandelson about this before the appointment, yes or no?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've already made clear that he was asked questions and gave untruthful replies. The government is complying with the humble address. The process has been set out. The independent adviser has looked at it, and he said, quote, "the relevant process for a political appointee was followed." Now, obviously, this is a question of my judgment, but what about her judgment? She wanted to rush into a war with Iran without thinking it through. At the weekend, Mr. Speaker, three weeks in, she said, "Oh, there isn't a clear plan behind the US strikes in Iran." That's the question she should have asked at the start. The decision to commit the UK to a war is the biggest decision a Prime Minister can take, and she got it completely wrong.
I didn't hear an answer, Mr. Speaker, and he's right. It is about his judgment. He has repeatedly told us that Peter Mandelson lied to him, but he won't tell us if he actually picked up the phone and spoke to Mandelson before appointing him. This doesn't make any sense. The Prime Minister told us on the record, and I quote, "I believed the lies he told me." If the Prime Minister didn't speak to him, how can he say he lied to him?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the process is clear. It's been looked at by the independent adviser. And she asked me about the process and judgment on appointments. She appointed the Shadow Justice Secretary. He said last night that Muslims praying in public, including the Mayor of London, practising his faith, are not welcome. He described it as an act of domination, straight from the Islamist playbook. If we're in my team, he'd be gone. It's utterly appalling. She should denounce his comments and she should sack him.
He wants to talk about justice secretaries. His justice secretary is abolishing jury trials. My shadow justice secretary is defending British values. I know who I would rather have sitting on the front bench next to me, and it's not him.
Prime Minister.
But Mr. Speaker, this is important. He does want to talk about anything else except what I'm asking him. 3 times I have asked him if the Prime Minister spoke to Peter Mandelson. 3 times he has refused to answer. We can only assume he did not speak to Peter Mandelson. From the documents published, we know he left the questioning of Mandelson's relationship with a convicted paedophile to 2 of Mandelson's closest friends, one of whom was also friends with a convicted paedophile. Asking those questions should have been his job. Why did he fail to do his duty?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, so her position is that the Shadow Justice Secretary is defending British values when he says Muslims praying together in Trafalgar Square are not welcome. Mr. Speaker, even Tommy Robinson, I can hardly believe I'm saying this, has said today that if the Shadow Justice Secretary had made these hateful comments 2 years ago, the Conservative Party would have kicked him out. Now, Tommy Robinson isn't some sort of moral signpost. He was pointing out how much their party has changed. They're more inclined to his views, and he's right about that. The fact that he's sitting on her front bench shows she's too weak and has got absolutely no judgment.
The Prime Minister wants to talk about my leadership. I'm shocked because his former deputy has just fired the starting gun on the race to replace him. And I'll tell him one thing. She and I both agree that this weak man should be replaced by a strong woman. But I'm not finished, Mr. Speaker. I have too much to say to him. There is still a lot to ask. There is still a lot to ask about the Mandelson files. There's still a lot to ask. The Prime Minister knew that Mandelson had kept up a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. The documents released also show he'd been warned about appointing Mandelson. He claims he was lied to. Mandelson had twice been fired for dishonesty. So why did the Prime Minister believe Peter Mandelson over the vetting documents?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, she asked about leadership. When I see religious events in Trafalgar Square, when I see Hindus celebrating Diwali, when I see Jews celebrating Hanukkah live, when I see Christians performing the Passion of Christ, or Muslims praying, that shows the great strength of our diverse city and country. I've never heard her party call out anything other than the Muslim events. It's only when Muslims are praying. The only conclusion is the Tory party has got a problem with Muslims.
Can I just say, people say, I am not responsible for the answers. I've just got to say that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a shame he's not responsible for the answers either. The Prime Minister wants us to believe that he is a serious leader, but he doesn't do the work. He outsources the decisions, and when things go wrong, he blames the vetting, he blames the Chief of Staff, he blames the Cabinet Secretary, he blames anyone but himself. This Prime Minister appointed Peter Mandelson, but didn't bother to ask the questions. If he cannot be straight with the House on something as simple as this, why should we believe a word he says about anything?
She talks about doesn't do it. 3 weeks ago, she said we should rush into war. She didn't do the work. She didn't think through the consequences. Committing our military to a war without thinking through the consequences is the gravest mistake a leader of the opposition can ever. And she comes back a week later and says, oops, I got that one wrong. She's utterly irrelevant, and she's got no judgment. This is the leader of the opposition who said I should have empty-chaired the most important NATO summit in years. This is the leader of the opposition who said Greenland is a second-order issue. And this is the leader of the opposition who jumped into a war with Iran without stopping to think. On top of that this week, the failure to condemn and sack...
Order. And I will repeat again, I'm not responsible for the answers, but we're certainly not opposition questions.
Mr. Speaker, add to that the failure to condemn and sack the Shadow Justice Secretary for the poison and division that he spreads. It's turning out to be quite a month for the leader of the opposition, who claims she never makes any mistakes.
What you just watched is a textbook example of how a political exchange can shift from a single question into a full-scale confrontation over credibility. At the centre of it is a very simple issue. Did Keir Starmer personally speak to Peter Mandelson about his past links to Jeffrey Epstein before making that appointment? It is a yes or no question. That matters because yes or no questions set a clear expectation. They limit interpretation. They force clarity. Now look at what actually happens. The question is asked once. No direct answer. It is asked again. Still no direct answer. It is asked a third time. The same pattern continues. At that point, the dynamic changes. The discussion is no longer about the appointment itself. It becomes about the refusal to answer. In political communication, repetition of a question without resolution creates pressure. The audience starts to focus less on the content and more on the gap. That gap is what drives the perception of evasion. To be precise, the Prime Minister does acknowledge responsibility for the appointment and states that he apologised. That is a substantive point. It shows ownership at a general level. But it does not resolve the specific question being asked. And in moments like this, specificity matters more than general accountability. When the question is narrow, the answer has to match that narrow frame. Instead, the response strategy shifts. First, it moves to process, references to advisors, procedures, and compliance. Then it moves to counterattack, criticism of the opposition's position on foreign policy. Then it shifts again, this time into a completely different domain, comments about religion, public events, and accusations involving party figures. Each of these moves serves a purpose. They introduce new topics. They dilute focus. They redistribute attention across multiple issues. This is a known strategy in high-pressure exchanges. When one line of questioning becomes difficult, expand the field. The problem is that expansion comes at a cost. The original question remains unanswered. And because it remains unanswered, every additional point feels like avoidance rather than argument. There is also a second layer to this moment: narrative control. When the Prime Minister brings in references to religious events and suggests selective criticism of Muslim gatherings, he is reframing the debate. He moves it from an accountability question about an appointment to a broader discussion about bias, inclusion, and political values. That is a significant shift. It changes the emotional center of the exchange. But again, timing matters. When a reframing happens before the original issue is resolved, it does not replace the question. It sits on top of it. That creates tension rather than clarity. Now consider the reference to Tommy Robinson. That is not accidental. Introducing a polarizing figure changes the tone immediately. It signals alignment, contrast, and political positioning. It also escalates the exchange beyond the original topic. This is how debates move from policy to identity. What does this moment actually show? A clear mismatch between the question asked and the answers given. A strategic shift from direct response to broader narrative control. A high-pressure environment where repetition exposes gaps in communication. It does not prove intent. It does not confirm what was or was not said in private. What it does show is which side maintained focus and which side expanded the scope to manage that pressure. For you as a viewer, the takeaway is straightforward. When a question is repeated, track whether it is answered. When the topic shifts, ask why it shifted at that moment. When new issues are introduced, separate them from the original claim. That method helps you stay anchored to the core issue, even when the conversation moves. If you want more breakdowns that focus on structure, clarity, and what actually holds up under pressure, make sure you like the video and subscribe.